You're listening to Spellbound. Welcome to episode 36 of Spellbound. I'm Julian Smith. Spellbound is now a CastBox original. You can still listen to it anywhere else you typically listen to podcasts, but check out CastBox today and see what's making it the fastest growing and highest rated podcast app for both iOS and Android. I'm joined today by Matthew Stewart, philosopher, historian, author of Nature's God, The Management Myth, and The Truth About Everything. Thanks for being here, Matthew. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Great to be here, Julian.
You graduated from Princeton University in 1985 with a concentration in political philosophy and were awarded the Sachs Scholarship from Princeton for study at Oxford, where you earned a DPhil in philosophy in 1988. We also have Andrew Rader. The fax machine is back again.
I'm back.
Andrew has a PhD from MIT in long-duration spaceflight and a general degree in all things from the School of Life. I like to say he's the smartest person in Canada because he won that game show, Canada's Greatest Know-It-All. But anyways, I digress. We're here today to talk about economics and the American Revolution and some interesting observations that Matthew has made about the American Revolution, which has been the focus of some of his writings recently. But anyways, I want to let Andrew lead this conversation here to start out with because he had a great question he wanted to lead with.
Yeah, Matthew, you came to our attention because we saw this article in The Atlantic. The 9% is the new American aristocracy. We always hear about the 1% being the problem in America and the wealth divide, but I think your idea was about the people just below that, the 9.9%, also putting up barriers to kind of prevent social mobility and being part of the problem in America as well in the wealth divide. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So let me start off by saying that the 1% or the those who have gained most from the concentration of wealth are a big problem, and I by no means want to dismiss that from our range of concerns. What I want to point out, though, is that in a system that has massive wealth inequalities, everybody ends up colluding in a certain way with that system. And it turns out that those who are, let's say, just one rung below the top, something like the aristocracy, they end up playing a particularly important role in perpetuating the system and in making it work, often in a very complex and unclear way. So I wanted to draw attention to that and to say, look, yes, we do have this concentration of wealth, but don't imagine that it's essentially a few rich people, this alleged 1%, against a universal middle class that shares all of its values. No, on the contrary, what's happening is that the concentration of wealth ends up dividing us all further down as well. And then that leads to even more instability and complications and makes this inequality problem much more intractable, much deeper than we tend to think. But we can't go back very easily to a simple, naive, universal middle class world.
If everybody's life is improving, but the lives of people at the top are improving more, does that matter? I mean, and I think maybe if you divide society into tiers, you have the people at the bottom whose lives really aren't improving a whole lot in the United States, at least. Around the world, I think poverty is decreasing dramatically. The U.S. is becoming more stratified, but everyone's life is improving at least a little on average. So is it really a problem if you have a wealth divide, and what kinds of problems does it create?
Right. That's a good question. And that's often the sort of first line of defense of inequality today, which is that, everybody has an air conditioner or a refrigerator, or almost everybody in the United States, at least. So,
right. Yeah.
I don't have air conditioning right now.
But it's a deeply flawed position for a number of reasons. One is that, just to state the facts clearly, there have actually been some reversals in the lower parts of the economic spectrum in the United States. So life expectancy has actually gone down a bit in some parts of the population, some of the less wealthy parts of the population. So it's actually not accurate to say that everyone is necessarily getting better off.
What evidence are you basing that on, Michael?
Is that like the drug crisis, the opioid crisis? Is that like suicide rates? What is that driven by?
The drugs and opioids are certainly part of it. My understanding is that they're about a third of that increase in mortality rates. So there are other factors as well. That's certainly part of it, but it's not the whole thing. There's higher incidence of many other health concerns too. So, but that's just to make sure that we have some of the basic facts right. But I think there still is a basic claim that you can make that on the whole, it's better to be a poor person in the United States than a poor person in many other parts of the world and at many other points in history. So should we really worry about rising inequality? And I would say, here's one important point to make, which is that when we talk about inequality now, we're usually talking just about financial inequality. And if you could isolate financial inequality and just treat it as its own little thing, I imagine that everything else worked independently of that, then I could see you could make a somewhat stronger case for a world in which there's lots of unevenness in outcomes. But here's the reality: it's that inequality in wealth is really just one part of inequality in power. Not inequality, not just in personal power, but in power to influence and shape political systems. One important consequence of inequality is that it leads to massive immobility, locks people in place. But it doesn't. The issue here isn't just that it locks people in place, and so perhaps it's unfair for those below. It's that it also locks systems in place. You get dramatically lower innovation. You get dramatically lower willingness to change things. Essentially systems that lock themselves into place and are unable to adapt. That's basically the story of most of human history until the modern era. And while we've managed to escape some of that with our modern and industrialized economies, I don't think there's anything that says we won't fall back into that. And we very well could fall back into that. So that's one consequence of inequality.
You're talking about businesses more or less that get so big that they are inflexible and they just incentivize to keep doing what they've always done and to not change things up.
Sure. Well, that's one way. Monopolies is one way that it happens, and that happened in the United States in the late 19th century, and to some degree, it's happening again. You have increasing concentrations of market power. Companies that basically get really big and they figure out how to control the markets, how to control the government that is supposed to regulate the markets. And that works out great for them. You end up with, a small number of very wealthy people. And then, of course, all the people who work for those companies tend to do pretty well. But it ends up strangling the economy. So that's one set of consequences. But then there's this other set of consequences that I really wanted to draw attention to, which is political instability. Now, you may think that it's quite all right for people, as long as they've got a chicken nugget in the toaster oven and some sort of moderate air conditioning, they're all going to be great, right? But the reality is that human beings always aspire to recognition. They always aspire to be something in the world and be recognized for their achievements. And when you set up a system where there isn't much of a realistic opportunity for them to do that, they will act out. But not only will they act out, they will be subject to a considerable amount of influence by those who have a lot more power than they do and a lot more control over messaging, media, and culture. And the net of all that is that you get a system that is profoundly irrational and unstable. So inequality, even if you allow that at the bottom the people are still able to feed themselves and so on, inequality over time, systematically, historically, produces instability. If you look at the world pre-1800, this is just blindingly obvious. But the point I would like to draw attention to is that if you look at the world now, today, you can see some of the same tendencies. So I think inequality has to be taken seriously. It's not just a matter of envy or bitterness about people who are not doing well, wishing they had more. It's actually an important part of the way in which a reasonable political system has to work. Human political systems, for most of human history, have been pretty abysmal. And in the last 200 or 300 years, we figured out something important. And the important thing we figured out is that for a society to work and be really productive and to lift everybody up, you have to have a thriving middle class. You have to have a world in which people can recognize themselves as being sort of meaningful participants acting in sort of equal mutual regard. Not that everybody ends up getting exactly the same paycheck or anything at all ridiculous like that, but just that people can have a certain degree of equality in the way they regard one another. So I look, I'd like people to take the inequality issue seriously. And I'd just like to make this other general point is that my perspective on this is very historical. I actually came to this by studying the American struggle over slavery. That's one of my book projects that I'm working on now. And I think that if people understand how this is played out in history, they'll frame the current problem differently, and they'll see it as a much more serious one than I think many people see it as today.
This comes back a little bit to the conversation we had with Darren Acemoglu. Are you familiar with him? The inclusivity?
Yeah, sure. I think his and who's his colleague? I can't remember. Their book is great.
Why Nations Fail.
Yeah, Why Nations Fail. Right. I think that they cover they get at some of this, and it's I think it's highly relevant. Their view is that it's political institutions historically that have essentially limited growth, that have forced nations to fail, and conversely, good institutions have allowed them to succeed. And the key difference is that you have either exclusive or inclusive institutions, and inclusive ones make growth possible, and exclusive ones essentially become extractive, and they just reduce large masses of the population to serving a small elite, and that ends up being very bad for the economy. And I think that on the fundamentals, they're absolutely right. And the only thing I would want to kind of expand a bit more is that I'm not sure I would limit this question of inequality and inclusiveness just to political institutions. I think that societies and cultures and so on, they also build up what you can call institutions. I think that they end up forming the way people think, the way they frame their own lives, the way they understand what they're doing. And all those things also feed into this same process. But at the end of the day, it's a similar... I think they're on the mark, and I think we're making a similar case that there has been something systemically wrong with a lot of human forms of organization, and it does come down to this issue of inequality, that you end up with a small number of people figuring out how to exploit a large number of people, and then that ends up being pretty deadly for growth and stability and economic success overall.
What role does education play? Because you're talking about money in politics, and this makes people vulnerable to political messaging of the elites who consolidate their power. So I don't know what the best solution to this is, other than change the institutions, or at least try to maintain the ones that we have that are inclusive in the United States. What would you say we should do about it? Does education play a role? Is it that the elites then dominate education as well because the school prices go up and only the wealthy can get into college? All these kinds of ideas. So, you're talking about people in America that if they're at the bottom, then they can't afford maybe education. They're just kind of treading water to stay afloat. So maybe they're not part of the system and they have no political power. So they just reactionary vote. So this is all kind of muddled up, but what would you say we should do about it? And is there anything we could do on an educational level and things like that?
Yeah. So, well, let's separate two questions that you got there. One is about solutions, and I'm going to punt on that for right now because that's big. I'm not a policy expert, and yeah, we do have to get to that. But let's just set that aside for a moment. Let's talk about the education issue and try to understand the problem better before we look for quick solutions on it. Look, education fundamentally, in the broad sweep of history, has been one of the great success stories of equality. So education became a mass phenomenon in the 19th century. Public schools came into being in the United States. And over the course of about a century, it was tremendously successful and helpful in building a middle class. So that's the good side of education. And a lot of that is still there. I don't think we should be too gloom and doomy here, because education still is, for many people, an important ticket out of limiting circumstances to better opportunities. But here's what's happened in the past half century or so as inequality has risen in the United States. A big part of our education system has become a way of reproducing privilege. So right now, here's the sad truth of the matter. You can go out and get a great education in an ideal sense, in the meaning of the term, learning what you're supposed to learn. But that's no guarantee that you're going to do particularly well in life or that you're going to move up in status. The guarantee comes from getting the right set of educational credentials, for going to the right college, and building up the right set of networks. So the result is that you now have one part of an educated population that has perhaps run up significant amounts of debt and has not gotten a payback. And then another part that often with advantage got the right set of credentials and is able to claim a dramatic reward. So we're getting this education has quietly morphed from a system that's supposed to create opportunity to a system that is essentially reproducing privileges. And that's a really serious problem. I mean, it makes the education no longer quite as compelling in itself as the true thing. But more than that, it makes this whole big system that we've invested so much time and effort into just a way of sorting the world into those who will make it and those who won't. And this is going to, I think, produce the big problems with inequality that we're seeing. And it's similar things have happened in the past, by the way. And China invented a kind of meritocracy. It had its exam systems, and that was good to a certain extent. But over the centuries, it became clear that certain classes had privileged access to this system, the exam system. That the exams themselves were pretty irrelevant to what actually happened later on in careers. And then the result was you had this kind of entrenchment, the suppression of innovation, this stratification of the classes, and sort of slow development through exploitative political systems. So we're moving towards that. That's, I think, the nature of the problem. And then we can talk about solutions. But why don't you come up with a solution before I do?
That's a pretty big. I think I'm going to punt on that one too.
Capital gains tax, I think, is the solution.
We actually need to put a pin right here to take our sponsored break. If you listen to this podcast regularly and you want to support us, then one of the best things you can do is engage with the brands that we feature. RX Bar is an amazing brand. I love working with them. If you're like me and you're on the go, sometimes you don't know when you're going to get a chance to eat. RX Bars are a healthy meal that fits in your pocket. Take it on a walk, take it on a hike, take it to a wedding. Sure, there may be caviar, but caviar is overrated. RX Bars are delicious and nutritious every time. Not to mention it goes in the pocket a little easier than caviar. Turns out real food ingredients actually taste really good. RX Bars are gluten-free, soy-free, dairy-free, and whether you prefer sweet, savory, chocolatey, or fruity, there is definitely an RX Bar for you. Never ever any artificial colors, artificial flavors, preservatives, or fillers. Egg whites are a source of protein that is easy for your body to absorb. It's not normal to see an egg white in a protein bar. That's what makes these protein bars so legit. It's like a freaking meal. It's like I keep saying. It fits in your pocket and it's like a freaking meal. I'll quit saying meal. They've also got this new RX nut butter, which sounds delicious. It's just got a few ingredients, egg whites, fruits, and nuts, just like the bars, but it's spreadable. It comes in squeezable packets, and it has 9 grams of high-quality protein. It pairs great with fruit, rice cakes, pretzels, or straight out of the pouch. When it comes to the bars, I personally prefer the dark chocolate sea salt and the vanilla coconut. When I eat them, I feel good. I feel like my body and I both got what we needed. A little treat, a little nutrition. Get 25% off your first order by visiting rxbar.com/spellbound, entering the promo code spellbound at checkout. That's rxbar.com/spellbound, promo code spellbound. Okay. Andrew was just about to go off on capital gains.
One of the problems is capital gains rates are lower than employment rates. So basically you pay higher taxes for working than for investing. So if you're Bill Gates and you have $60 billion, a few years later you have $90 billion and you're paying a lower tax rate than if you'd earned that extra money. Now, there is a reason for that and encourages investment in the United States. So it's kind of in the country's best interest to keep the rates low, but it does have the side effect of creating this wealth gap. And I think that's one of the things that perpetuates it.
Okay, my short word on that is baloney. Okay, I actually make most of my income through investment. That's just a fact. I wish I could make it through books, but writing books about the American Revolution is not would not keep my kids in college. And I don't think there's any evidence that preferred treatment for capital gains produces any significant improvement in investment anywhere. This is probably the purest example of the wealthy gaming the system to their advantage.
Oh, so you're saying it is the problem, and the argument that people use to protect against that is baloney, right? So you're saying you're actually kind of agreeing with what I was saying, that capital gains
I agree exactly.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to accuse you of baloney. I was accusing your hypothetical antagonist there. When the CBO did an estimate of the cost of these this preferential treatment for investment income, and it came out to $160 billion in 2013. So I imagine it's somewhat higher than that now. And this is quite simply money that goes from the public to wealthy investors. and I'll just raise my hand and say I probably took a little bit of that, a tiny bit myself. It's frankly, unconscionable. And the only reason why it happens for two reasons. One is that the propaganda has been very effective in convincing people that, this is, these are the job creators and we need to give the job creators more money. And then the other reason is that our tax system creates this perverse way of spending money. We think the tax breaks are basically free, it's not that I'm, taking money from the government, I'm just not paying taxes on it, right? But that's just nonsense. There would be no difference.
Someone has to pay it.
Yeah, someone has to pay it. So if basically I paid the money in taxes and the government then wrote me back a check for the difference, that would be the same thing. And no one would question that is actually a subsidy from the government. But because we do it through the tax break thing, people imagine, it's not.
But it's the same thing as the estate tax, and the Republicans are actually trying to index it to inflation, the capital gains, which would be even worse. So they're trying to make it more favorable.
Yeah, sure. No, they're just looking for more ways to funnel the money to themselves and their families and the people they know and love. I mean, it's pretty striking. But unfortunately, this is the way human beings have behaved throughout history, and the great achievement of democracy historically has been to shine a light on it all and hopefully to give the people enough power so that they can respond to it and try to make things a little more fair. But that's where inequality becomes a vicious circle, right? Because the more inequality you have, the more they're able to essentially stop that check, right? The more they are able to dominate the political system, and the more they're able to also, frankly, dominate the culture and manipulate the cultural messaging. So it becomes a kind of vicious circle or a runaway cycle where it reinforces itself.
Just so people don't get the wrong idea, you're a capitalist. You're not saying all power to the Soviets and stuff like that. You kind of
yeah. I guess
you're just saying that there needs to be political institutions so that the playing field isn't overly tilted in the direction of the wealthy.
Yeah, no, I'm a capitalist, and I understand the virtue. Here's the virtue of what we call a market, which is that you have a competition where people have something at stake and they try to do as best they can, and that's what motivates people, and that's what gets them going. That's great. Here's the basic problem: we don't have markets, and we don't have proper capitalism. It's not that we need to replace them with Soviets or some alternative to the market. A market is something that has to be set up. You have to have rules for the market. You have rules about property. You have rules about what constitutes property. Intellectual property. I write books, right? They're governed by copyright laws. That's not something that exists in nature. There has to be a law that we all agree on, or that we do through our political institutions, that says what that copyright means, how long I have a right to publish this book and claim the earnings from it. That's not created in nature. That's a rule that we set up. Now, what happens is that we have set up some pretty bad rules in a lot of cases, and that creates markets that are completely distorted, that are tilted to the point where you don't have a free and open competition. Similarly, with capital, at the end of the day, we like to pretend that capital and labor are completely different things, but they're both what human beings do, right? Capital is just playing with accumulated labor in some sense or another. And I do kind of think that Lincoln, by the way, was right when he said that at the end of the day, everything comes from labor because we, as human beings, making stuff. But let's set aside those theoretical arguments. The point I want to make is that the division between capital and labor isn't in nature. That also is something that we establish through specific laws that define what constitutes property, what constitutes work, what constitutes a wage relation, and so on. And all of those things have been more and more set up to advantage one group of people over another. Let me make another point just so that we can swat away these allegations of Soviet communism and all that. In different industrialized countries, some of which are doing at least as well as the United States, you have some significant differences in the way these issues are treated. So, for example, in many other countries, let's say Germany, for example, labor has a seat at the board. Or in France, labor unions in general have more favorable laws. And the results of that can actually be read off of the numbers. And the results are very simply that wages are higher in those countries and inequality is lower. So I'm not going to say that they have a perfect system or that ours is radically imperfect, but what I will say that is on certain points, you can see these differences. and they don't work to our advantage. We have allowed the power of labor versus capital to atrophy dramatically over the past 50 years. It's all been done in the name of free markets and so on. And what is the net effect of that? The net effect is professionals who are not labor, but they're some other kind of category and are allowed to form associations have been doing incredibly well because they've formed their own little union-like entities that guarantee their income. But people who are not professionals, again, an arbitrary distinction, but there you have it, they, on the whole, have seen their wages decline, even as their productivity has gone up. And who's the beneficiary? Well, it's the owners of capital who, are spread around society, but concentrated very much among the most wealthy. So I don't think we have to necessarily, rip everything up from the ground and start all over again, because there are examples around the world where countries are organizing themselves better than we are with respect to these fundamental questions about equity and equality.
Would you say one of the examples of the tilted playing field is the bank bailout in the last financial crisis? I think someone called it socialism for the wealthy and capitalism for the rest.
Yeah, and I think that's fair to say. I think I actually may have written something about that in my book, The Management Myth, which came out right around the time of the financial crisis. I think I wrote it sort of during, but before the bailout was in full swing. But it's pretty amazing to me that we're happy to conceive of bailouts like that in the framework of, let's say, insurance. That okay, the government is there to step in when a bad thing happens and make sure it's all right. Well, that was basically free insurance because up until that crisis, the financial institutions were operating without paying for any insurance, without basically anticipating these issues. So yeah, they basically took the gains, and when they had losses, it was all socialized through this public insurance. And here's the perversity of that: when you talk about individuals, we don't think of the safety net as a form of insurance, and yet we should, right? We basically call it a safety net because the idea is, you basically are a loser. You failed in society. You're unemployed or you're disabled and so on. So we'll throw you a few pennies, but we don't, in fact, do much in terms of socializing the in terms of providing the same kind of insurance that we provide to the bankers. So yeah, I think that the 2008 thing is a pretty interesting case in point. And I guess we all know the history now, right? That what was it? A year or two after getting their bailouts, the financial institutions were offering record bonuses to their
record profits,
directors, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, it's kind of pretty much there, all on the front pages.
Michael, one more question about this, and then we're going to take a little bit of a shift in the talk. What do you think about the universal basic income?
I'm open to it, and I think it should be part of the discussion. I want to hedge a little bit here and say I'm definitely open to it, but I'm not committed. And I'll tell you a couple of things that concern me. So I don't think our problem fundamentally is that our system, our markets reward those who have exceptional talents and leave others behind, and that therefore we have to kind of shift the income around. Okay? I actually don't think that's the issue. I think that redistributing income in some ways takes for granted or assumes something that I don't think is the case, which is that all of that income was generated through a, let's say, proper, fair, equitable process. I would prefer to focus much more on rebalancing power in our system. And I will bet that if you do that, human beings being what they are and being roughly, naturally much more equal than we tend to imagine, you will get much more equitable outcomes than running a game system and then taking some of the winnings and shoveling them back to the people who didn't win the game.
But what about in light of automation and artificial intelligence and things like that they're continuing to take jobs?
Yeah, I know that's an argument. Universal basic income, I see it as treating a symptom, and I want to get at the cause, because I think the fundamental cause is an imbalance in power that artificially constrains certain kinds of income and artificially inflates other kinds. So if you get at with the power of earning, you'll have less of a need for that kind of corrective post facto correction. Now, in terms of artificial intelligence and so on, I'm a skeptic there as well, because history shows pretty clearly that when you have these new technologies, you do get significant disruptions. One of the great things, and Schumpeter pointed this out, one of the great things about a sort of modern system is that it does allow this kind of creative destruction. And as long as the system is healthy and reasonably democratic, it should be able to sustain it. And Schumpeter was concerned that it wouldn't, that at some point it becomes sclerotic. And that is a problem. But I'm not clear yet why AI should be different from any other major technological revolution in that respect.
Well, automation's already taken 5 million jobs since 2010, and we need 75,000 jobs a year to keep up with population growth, and we haven't created any new jobs in the last 10 years, so it's a math problem.
Yes and no. I mean, well, employment is actually, or unemployment is actually relatively low now, but you can't argue that basically that some people have been pushed out of the workforce.
It's the lower end jobs that are going away right now, but it's going to continue to get more sophisticated, right, and it's going to continue to be more problematic. Right now, it's just like, all the highly automated, the jobs that would be highly automated naturally, like factory jobs and things like that. But nothing's really safe, 50 years out, 100 years out.
Right. But again, what happens with these technological changes is the nature of jobs shift. Yes, you lose certain kinds of jobs, but hopefully you regain certain others. But let me point to one issue where I do think there's a problem that's perhaps more specific to AI, and where I think we have to be very alert. And that's that I think AI is an example of a modern technology that lends itself to monopoly, and not only to monopoly, but to an extreme concentration of power. So I'm less concerned about these economic effects on jobs. I think that if you have the right system, they will take care of themselves to some degree. But I'm much more concerned about the fact that AI naturally tends towards those two things. It tends towards monopoly, and I think it tends that way because, Google is sort of teaching us this, that when you become the place that amasses all of the information, then you are the one that has all of the market power. And I do think that our big tech companies are close to monopolies. That may not be the completely accurate term for it, but we just need new language to describe what's happening because it is, in effect, something of that nature. It's something that basically concentrates economic power and then concentrates political power in ways that I think can be really, really damaging. So on the concentration of political power, that's the other part of AI that I think we need to be very, very concerned about, which is that human beings are, as we all know, we all have limited powers of cognition and reasoning. And AI is basically a really, really powerful tool for manipulating human beings. And I'm probably less worried about the machines manipulating us than I am about people figuring out how to use machines to manipulate us, and therefore leading to a kind of amazing and incredibly dangerous concentration of political power. So those, I think, are huge issues to worry about in AI. But I would like to shift the discussion a bit away from the idea of AI as a job killer, because that I don't think historically is really where the source of the problem lies.
Yeah, that's unfortunately probably a different conversation anyways, but we've talked so much about economics and stuff, and there's other things we wanted to talk to you about, so this is probably a good time to shift. I wanted to hear you talk about deism as the philosophical basis for the American Revolution. You talk about this in your latest book, and I just thought it'd be interesting to hear you explain it a little more.
Here's the interesting thing about the American revolutionaries. They were far outside of the mainstream of their own time in terms of their religious and political thought. So today, I think we tend to think of deism as a kind of a holy creed, because, broadly speaking, we're all mostly taught in high school at some point that deism is the belief that there was a deity of some sort, a supreme being who created the world at some time in the past, we don't know when, and then walked away, created a really nice world that operates according to the laws of nature, science, and so on, and then walked away and left things kind of on their own for human beings to take care of. So we tend to think of that today as still being relatively holy and theistic. In its own time, it was heresy. It was worse than heresy. I mean, to be called a deist in colonial America was basically to be called something close to a pedophile or
really.
an abomination. Oh yeah, it was used right. If you read the sermons of the time, well, because it frankly is indeed completely heretical. I mean, if you are like take George Whitefield, the famous evangelical preacher who sparked the Great Awakening in colonial America. If you're a believer like him, then you think that the Bible is the Word of God, and God intervenes in the world regularly. He might plant a kind of deformed cauliflower at your feet to tell you that you're on the wrong path. There's lots of other things that God will do.
Always vegetables.
God's clearly vegan.
Yeah, it is. It's funny. Sometimes it's clouds too. I mean, seriously, there were those thunderstorms.
Farm animals too, I think, right? Yeah.
and deism basically says, no, God is not doing any of that stuff in the world. And yeah, there was this deity, but by the way, it doesn't look remotely human. He's interested in the orbits of the planets. And he would never actually bother to write a Bible for some strange species on one of the many inhabited planets in the universe, right? So it was, in fact, heretical. So that's the first point I want to make. And I think there's two important consequences to draw from that. The first is that essentially means that the ideas that were important in forming the American Republic, the things that were real breakthroughs, not everything, not the Tea Party and, not the, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes kind of stuff, but the ideas that were new and really different, that all of those were in some way tied to a kind of thinking and a philosophical tradition that was really unusual and really outside what human beings for the preceding millennia had really taken to be as the basic building blocks of life. So that's the first major point. And I guess the other point, to be a little more even radical, is that I think if you get to the core of deism, if you set aside some of its rhetoric, it's really not different from pantheism. And pantheism, I mean a rationalistic pantheism. So by that I mean a doctrine that says the only thing that you can identify with a God at all is just the totality of the world. So whatever it is, whenever you say God, all you're doing is just kind of using a metaphor for the world
or nature.
And I think if you push or nature, and I think if you push that even farther, it really is just a fancy way of being an atheist. And it's important, sometimes the fancy bit is good because some atheism is a little bit kind of blunt and just like a statement of what I don't believe and things like that. But I think this is a somewhat different concept, not contradictory with that, but just a little more.
You could say it makes someone atheist.
Julian always says it's like simulation theory, deism, basically.
Yeah,
right. But I guess I was trying to get at what really mattered in the creation of the modern world in terms of ideas, and I think it's something in that area, in this kind of some fairly radical and heretical ideas about what human beings are and how we work. Well, there's a lot more complexity to it, but I'd like people to understand that deism is a lot more interesting than people think it is, a lot more heretical, and it also extends much wider, has a much wider reach in terms of understanding politics, in terms of understanding human nature, and so on.
So what's the difference between deism and a religion like Catholicism and Christianity? And then secondly, why do you think pantheism is so controversial in the West?
Well, first, on the last point, by the way, I don't think pantheism is controversial at all now. I mean, the funny thing is how the Overton window, or the sort of middle point, has shifted so dramatically in the past 2 centuries. But how is it different? Deism is essentially part of a religion of nature, and what that means is that it regards science as the only meaningful way to approach anything of interest in the world. So it rejects any idea that you can have some sort of alternative communication with a deity or with the divine or with the sacred. It says, yeah, there may be something divine and sacred in the world, but the only way you get at it is by studying nature. And you study nature using facts, evidence, observation, and logic. So that's, I think, the crucial difference. There's no leap of faith anywhere,
no revelation
in deism. Yeah, there's no revelation.
You also talked a little bit in your book about Thomas Young writing Ethan Allen's book. Can you talk about that? I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas Young was, I thought I'm so pleased that I found him. There are a few people who have written about him, but not many Americans know that this individual actually played a pretty significant underground role in the American Revolution. I mean, he was the one who was, I think, critical in getting the Boston Tea Party going. Before that, getting the Boston Committee of Correspondence going. He played a key part in the Philadelphia Revolution that was necessary in order to actually get the Declaration of Independence. So he's a really interesting character. And then Ethan Allen, people know about him. He has nothing to do with furniture. Let's make that clear.
I got a couple couches from that guy.
Green Mountain Boys.
But he's known mainly for the Green Mountain Boys thing, which of course is his claim to fame. But he's less known today for what he was infamous for in his own time, which was that he was an infidel, a deist, who wrote a tract basically saying the Christian religion and all the other religions are bunk. Reason is the only oracle of man, and so on. So offering the whole deist creed. Now, then there was this theory in some of this is like a theory that like three people in Vermont and I were concerned about, which is that Ethan Allen, the idea is that Ethan Allen was, as the Green Mountain Boy, must have been so strong that he must have been really dumb. And if he was so dumb, he couldn't possibly have written a book. So therefore, his friend, Thomas Young was his friend, probably wrote the book for him, right? And that actually was kind of the consensus theory, mainly because not many people had paid much attention to it, I think.
This is widely believed?
He said four people.
Widely believed
among the four
people. Among Vermont historians, right?
So what's the connection and what's the significance of this book's influence on Western culture?
Here's the important point is that Thomas Young didn't, as far as I can tell, have anything to do with the writing of Ethan Allen's book in any direct sense. He had a lot to do with it in that he certainly talked with Ethan Allen about deism and conveyed to him a lot of the ideas that Ethan Allen put into his book. And here's where it becomes really interesting. Thomas Young was pretty well read. He'd gone back and read earlier philosophers from Europe, but Ethan Allen was not, by his own admission, and you can tell from his book that he was not. But Ethan Allen ended up putting into his book a lot of the ideas that came from these books through Thomas Young. And then if you extend your focus a little bit wider, you can see that similar things were happening across the colonies. There were a lot of people like this who were writing little tracts and so on, and they were getting a lot of these ideas in place. Now, if you trace those ideas back, what you find is that they come back to some of the most interesting, some of the most radical, and also some of the most persecuted philosophers in European history. So what you find is that these are ideas that floated up from the ancient philosopher Epicurus, who was condemned as an atheist in early modern Europe. They passed through people like Spinoza and Thomas Hobbes. They were packaged up by the philosopher John Locke, made to seem a little more friendly, but still quite heretical.
Not to be confused with Lost.
Yeah, exactly. And so they made their way into American thought and profoundly shaped, I think, America's revolution in this kind of underground way. So I think it's a really interesting story, and I hope I got at least some of it out there. I think America's revolution is a lot more philosophically interesting than people have generally supposed. And part of that is because after the revolution, there was a significant counter-revolutionary movement that wanted to kind of tampen everything down and, put everything back in order. And so, a lot of myths were created to make the American Revolution seem more friendly and less French and, more conservative and so on. And it was so in its impact, but not because the original revolutionaries were that way, but because the successors essentially tended to be much more conservative.
So, Matthew, because you're a historian from Boston, I wanted to ask you if you thought the American Revolution, if it hadn't happened, the United States might end up like Canada, which is to say exactly the same, except earlier abolition of slavery, universal health care, and the metric system.
And being a little nicer and having Tim Hortons.
I think that's look, historical counterfactual is, I will be fired from any history department if I conjecture too far. And of course, I won't be hired to begin with, so it's probably okay. But I think that's a good one. I think that look, the American Revolution is interesting. It's fascinating, but you're right in a certain sense that we can ask whether it was too soon. because it was in a way too soon. And what happened was that precisely because it was too soon, and precisely because the United States still had these incredibly exploitative and oppressive institutions, namely slavery above all, that revolution ended up being co-opted to serve those. And it wasn't until, I would argue, the Civil War that we had the kind of completion of at least that first phase of the American Revolution.
Yeah, it was resolving the things that had been unresolved from the American Revolution.
Yeah, right. And maybe if we'd, they'd been a little less hot-headed and, allowed the things to play out, you're right. Maybe Canada would have been the alternative. And frankly, I think it's worth considering whether we would be better off.
It also really walked a knife edge, because I think the French revolutionaries were very similar. They were deists. They wanted to overturn all the systems and institute absolute science. I think that they had like a metric day, metric hours, metric month. Everything was metric. That's where actually the metric system comes from. But it eventually culminated in Napoleon and chaos and the Reign of Terror, and was replaced by a monarchy in the end. Although France sort of repeated that in the same tradition multiple times, had many revolutions. I guess they're on their fifth republic right now.
Yeah, that's right, and I think that unfortunately, when a modern revolution fails, it hands a huge arsenal of weapons to its enemies, the counter-revolutionaries, because the failure of the French Revolution. It was a devastating blow. And in fact, that's also partly what set the American cause back pretty dramatically, because in the early 19th century, when the French Revolution first broke out, the Americans were, on the whole, incredibly enthusiastic and thought, well, now we did it, now the French are doing it. Look how grand this is. We set off a great world, explosion of liberty.
Until they started chopping off heads.
Exactly. And at that point, things changed very dramatically in the United States. And that then also led many Americans to reject parts of the American Revolution and say, well, there were certain parts of the American Revolution that were a little too French, a little too radical, aspects like, for example, Thomas Paine. So it had that kind of failure has this tremendous knock-on effect. So we can ask whether it might have worked out better if people could have spread out the conflict over time so that it could be resolved in a more peaceful way.
So I probably should have led with this question, but why write a book on this? Why write a book on deism's influence on the American Revolution? What's the significance of it? What's the big thing that you think people should take away from this?
Well, there are two reasons to write it. Okay, one is that the myths that now exist in America are not just wrong, but deadly. I think that all the kind of Christian nation stuff that floats around and that, frankly, plays a huge role in deciding our election results, I think that is incredibly harmful. I think it produces a kind of nationalism that is regressive and dangerous. So that's one reason. I want to be a myth buster to the extent I can. But the second reason, in a way, is more important to me personally, which is that there's a really interesting story here to tell. It's an interesting story about ideas. I learned a lot from it. I think people can learn a lot from it. I think it's, as I think I said a couple minutes ago, the American Revolution is philosophically much more interesting than I think most people know. And it's philosophically interesting, not just in a purely historical way, but in the sense that we can learn something now philosophically. We can kind of take some bearings from it and from what the profound ideas that pass through it. So I guess that's the other reason to write a book like this.
Well, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. It's great having you here, and want to encourage everybody to check out your latest book, Nature is God. And when's your new book going to be out? You said a couple years.
Well, so I'm working on two books. One will be on this theme of inequality. I want to basically approach some of the issues that I brought up in that Atlantic piece, but in a more philosophical and historical way. And then the second one is really kind of a sequel to Nature's God, because it's about the role of philosophy in the struggle over slavery. Again, what I'm going to show there is that it's much more interesting than people know, and that the philosophy involved was a lot, it ranged more widely, it was more contradictory, and it was more heretical than I think people imagine today. So I hope that will be an interesting story too.
What did you make of this episode? Leave a comment if you feel so inclined on the new YouTube channel, youtube.com/spellboundshow. It's brand new. We still haven't really officially launched it yet, so go subscribe there. Be an early adopter. Remember to subscribe. Makes your life a little easier. You don't have to remember the episodes. They just show up on your phone magically somehow. You can also support us by rating us or leaving a review on Apple Podcast or CastBox. That helps tremendously in the ranking systems, and we appreciate it. We don't care much, but we appreciate it. We know it takes time to do that, so much appreciated. Thanks so much for listening. This has been Spellbound. I'm Julian Smith. I'll see you guys next Monday. Take care.